Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to Lily's second show tell of the season. I'm really excited. My name is April Shepard, and I am the chair of the web committee for Lily. Lily stands for Lifelong Information Literacy, and we are a group of librarians and information professionals who work to promote lifelong information literacy. If you'd like to know more about Lily or to join, I've put my email address in my Zoom name so you can find it pretty easily. Before we begin, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items. First of all, please make sure your mic is on mute unless you're talking. There's over 100 of us, so it can get kind of noisy and distracting. 2, please make sure you're respectful of each other. I don't expect that to be a problem. If you're here, you're probably pretty awesome. 3, given how many of us there is, we may or may not be able to get to every question. I will keep an eye on the chat and mark things down as I see them. So we'll do our best to get through everything. But if not, you can shoot me an email. I'll make sure Andrea gets it. Also, if you're just not comfortable in the group setting, you could also just shoot me an email that way too, and I'll make sure she gets it. And then finally, we do have some open slots in the spring. So if you have a really cool idea regarding information literacy, you want to present on it, again, shoot me an email and let me know. And then I also want to thank the Lily Web Committee. I'm not a solo person. I have lots of people who help me put this together, maintain the Lily website, do our show and tell. So thank you, all of them. Now to our speaker. Andrea Baer is the History Political Science Librarian at Rowan University in the Campbell Library. She's been an academic instruction librarian for 10 years. Prior to entering librarianship, she taught and studied comparative literature and writing. Her research interests include the intersections between information literacy and writing studies, effect and learning, and critical reflective practice. So Andrea, it's all on you now.
Well, thank you to everyone in Lily for making this happen, and to everyone who's here today. I appreciate you guys taking the time, and I'm glad we'll have a chance to hopefully share some ideas at the end. So in addition to my presentation, I hope that we can have some time for discussion at the end. So I did share my slides with the link in the chat, but I'm going to put that in there one more time. So feel free to be looking at that at the same time. There are a couple of links that I'll refer to that may be easier for you to click on if you have the slides open, but yeah. Okay, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. Oh no.
Yeah, I was going to say,
I'm not so good.
Yeah, your sound's a little wobbly there.
Do I still sound choppy?
No,
okay.
You sound better now.
Okay, April, when I share my screen, it's going to be a little hard for me to see everything that's happening in the chat. So could you interrupt me if I start to sound shaky again?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And similarly, if there are questions during the presentation portion of this that need to be answered immediately, April, if you don't mind interrupting, and I'll do my best to answer things that need to be clarified in the moment. So
can do.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I am going to share my screen, sharing my slides here, and oh, sorry, sometimes I forget to do this. I want to share with audio because I am going to be showing you a video. So let me redo this so that I don't forget to do that later. Okay. All right, can everyone see that? Hopefully you all can see that.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to be sharing today about a workshop that I offer through our library workshop series at Rowan University called Debunking Misinformation. And so to do that, I will be giving a little bit of background on the topic of debunking misinformation, and then sharing about how I structure the workshop. And then we'll have some time for discussion and possibly some interaction, depending on how many questions there are at the end. Okay, so I'd like to start first with a land acknowledgement. The land that I'm on is the ancestral home of the Lenape tribe nation, also known as the Lenni Lenape and Delaware people. Their historical territory includes present-day New Jersey and eastern Pennsylvania along the Delaware River watershed, New York City, Western Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. Most of the Lenape were forced from this region by European colonizers and the Indian removal policy that are part of a long history of colonialism. Today, Lenape people belong to the Delaware Nation and Delaware Tribe of Indians in Oklahoma, the Stockbridge-Munsee community in Wisconsin, and the Munsee-Delaware Nation, Moravian of the Thames First Nation, and Delaware of Six Nations in Ontario. This is also a good moment for me to acknowledge.
Before you begin, you have a black box at the top of your screen. I don't know if there's something else in front of your screen or what.
No, it's probably the Zoom controls that are showing.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if there is a way for me to remove that. Is it just a small box?
It's across the top, and they're saying that you can hide the panel.
I can hide the panel. All the things you don't know when you're sharing your screen, right? Hide floating meeting controls. Okay, thank you all. I didn't know that. That's good to know. After this long into a pandemic, you'd think I would have learned that by now, but always learning something. Perfect. Okay, thanks. So this is also a good moment for me to acknowledge my positionality, because that certainly influences how I come into the world and how I approach pretty much anything. So I am a white cisgender female. I grew up in the United States in a middle-class family and had the good fortune to have a fair amount of education. So that certainly has influenced how I think about librarianship, how I think about teaching, and how I think about teaching about misinformation. And as I'll be discussing today, when we're thinking about how people engage with information, including misinformation, people's personal backgrounds, experiences, beliefs, of course, play a big role in what they believe or don't believe, and how they evaluate information. So that will be a kind of recurrent theme that we'll see as we're thinking about strategies for debunking misinformation. So I'll give a little bit of context for this workshop that I offer. I've been doing this since, I guess, 2020, spring of 2020, I started doing this workshop, and it is part of the Rowan University Libraries workshop program. So there's a link in the slides to that workshop program if you'd like to see more details about all of the workshops that are offered, as well as the description of the Debunking Misinformation workshop. And by the way, I will be offering it in the spring. Yeah, it is open. The registration is open to anyone. So if you wanted to attend this, and see it in action, it is going to be there. Yeah. And I've facilitated this so far only online, but it is adaptable for in-person settings as well. And I'm looking at the potential for expanding the workshop to different venues and different audiences. I see this workshop as really relevant to not just the academic community, but to the general public. And I think these are really important things for people to learn about. So if people have thoughts, ideas for areas for expanding this, I would love to hear from you. And for those of you who attended the other Lily presentation I did a couple of weeks ago on algorithmic bias, that workshop is also part of this Rowan University Libraries workshop program. So I take a somewhat similar approach to those two workshops. So the outcomes for this debunking misinformation workshop are as follows. First is to recognize the challenges of debunking misinformation. So sometimes people think that if they just correct inaccurate information, that that's sufficient, that people will then remember the accurate information and discard the inaccurate information. But there is a psychology to why it's very difficult for people to let go of incorrect information that they already were presented with and to correct their, correct that misinformation. So we'll be getting into some of why that is difficult. Second is to recognize the role that confirmation bias plays in how people look for and respond to information that reinforces and challenges their views. So confirmation bias is basically the human tendency to believe things that fit our pre-existing views and to discard beliefs that don't fit those pre-existing views. And sometimes this happens in very subtle ways. Often we're not conscious of how confirmation bias is affecting the decisions we're making or how we're evaluating information. And then finally is to identify and apply effective strategies for debunking misinformation. Okay, so I want to outline some of the challenges of debunking misinformation before then getting into how I actually do the workshop. But first, I'd like to get some sense of people's experiences with this topic. So I'm going to launch a poll. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen here for a second. You know, I'm learning a new thing, which is that I need to get those access controls back, and I'm not sure how to do it. April, can you help me out here? I need to launch this poll, and thank you. Okay, so we've got our first poll is on how familiar you are with the topic of debunking misinformation. 1, new to the topic. 2, familiar with the concept. 3, knowledgeable. And 4, highly knowledgeable. We've got things coming in. Like we've got still some answers coming in. We're slowing down. Okay. I think I'm gonna end the poll and share the results here. April, it says it failed to share the poll, that another poll is started. Can you help me with that?
I don't know why it would say that.
Let me try again. I don't know if it. Okay, so you should see that now. Okay. 18% new to the topic. Results. Can you all see that? Okay, 18% new to the topic, 49% familiar, 30% knowledgeable, and 4% highly knowledgeable. Okay, so range of experiences. And then secondly, I want to do another poll. This one is going to be teaching experience. So again, on a scale of 1 to 4, if you can say how much teaching experience you have with this. 1, for have not taught. 2, you touch on the topic but not in depth. 3, you address the topic at times with some degree of depth. And then 4, you teach about this regularly. Again, we have a range of experiences, still a few answers coming in. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Share the results. All right, so we got 40% have not taught about it, 35% touch on the topic, 18% address the topic at times with some degree of depth, and 7% teaching about it regularly. So I hope we get to hear some about other people's experiences with teaching on this then. Okay. All right, so I assume you all can still see my screen. Is that correct? You still see the slides there?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to put this back in present mode. Okay, now time allowing, we will take some time at the end to reflect on these questions, but I want to introduce them now because whether we have time to discuss them or not, I think they're useful for people to have in the back of their minds, and then hopefully we'll continue to reflect on these questions after today's workshop as well. So how does the topic of debunking misinformation fit or not fit into your teaching? What opportunities do you see for teaching about debunking strategies, and what barriers do you see to teaching about it? And as you're thinking about those barriers, you might also be thinking about possible responses to those barriers. Okay. So first, to say a little bit about the psychology of debunking, you may have heard of the concept of the continued influence effect of misinformation. Essentially, this means that once we have been introduced to misinformation, it is difficult for us to dislodge that from our brains. It's difficult to replace it with the correct information. So misconceptions are embedded into people's what we'll call mental models. And so when that information gets corrected, it kind of disrupts the mental model. and it leaves a gap. And that gap needs to be filled with something else. So for the corrected information to stick, it needs to fit better into the mental model than does the myth. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And there's more to it than that, but that's the basic idea of why the misinformation that has already been introduced is difficult to replace with correct information. John Cook is a climate change scientist who has done a lot of work in this area, and he's much more articulate about it than I am. So I'm going to show the first 4 minutes of this video on making sense of climate science denial, and he talks about some strategies for debunking. And yeah, I also show this during the workshop, but I'll just show a few minutes here so you can get a better sense of this idea.
When I started Skeptical Science in 2007, my approach was simple: debunk climate myths with research from scientific journals. I'd been doing that for several years when I got an email from a psychology professor, Stefan Lewandowski. He said I might be interested in some research by Norbert Schwartz on the psychology of debunking. I have vivid memories of reading that study with a growing feeling of horror. That research found if you debunk myths in the wrong way, you risk reinforcing the misconception rather than removing it. I compared this incorrect method to what I was doing at Skeptical Science. They were the same. That email turned out to be a life-changing moment. I resolved to read every piece of research that focused on the psychology of debunking. What I learnt was that debunking myths is not as simple as you might think. To understand what happens when you correct a misconception, you need to understand how people think. As we learn new information, we build mental models of how the world works. That's because we think inside our heads, and the world is mostly outside of our heads. Having a complete working mental model means we understand something. In such a model, all the different parts of the model fit together like cogs. However, you can think you understand something, but your understanding is actually wrong. In that case, a misconception that a person believes to be true gets integrated into their mental model. When you debunk a myth, it's like reaching into someone's mind and plucking out that dodgy part of their mental model. You create a gap in their model. However, people feel uncomfortable when their mental models are incomplete. They want to feel as if they know what's going on. They'll even prefer a complete but false model to an incomplete but more accurate model. For that reason, after you tell someone that a myth is wrong, the myth can come back to fill the gap again. People continue to be influenced by the myth because they want to avoid gaps in their mental models. This is known as the continued influence effect of misinformation. So when you debunk a myth, you also need to fill the gap you just created. You need to replace the myth with a fact to complete the model again. For example, if there's a suspect in a murder trial, it's not enough to provide evidence that the suspect is innocent. To prove the suspect innocent, at least in people's minds, you need to provide an alternative suspect. How does this translate to practical action? Well, your alternative fact needs to be plausible. It needs to fit into the person's mental model as well or better than the myth did. What do I mean by that? A myth is like a cog in a person's mental model, interlocking with all the other cogs. Your alternative fact needs to fit in with all the other cogs. In fact, it should fit even better than the myth. The person should feel as if they understand the world better after the debunking. Also, to help people let go of the myth, it's generally a good idea to put the emphasis on the facts, not the myth. You don't want to make your debunking all about the myth, which helps keep it alive. Using the myth as a headline makes people more familiar with the myth. When people read one of these myths versus facts flyers that states something like, the side effects of the flu vaccine are worse than the flu, that's a myth. As time passes, the details fade, and all they remember is the myth. Yes, something about side effects of the flu vaccine. That's because the intended correction repeated and emphasized the myth, making it more familiar. And the more familiar people are with a piece of information, the more likely they will believe it's true.
Okay, so I'm going to stop I think it's worth watching that whole video, but for the sake of time, we're going to stop with that for now. And I realize that bar is showing up again, so let's see if I can make that go away again. Okay. So by the way, you may have laughed when he said alternative facts. That came out before Kelly Conaway, was that in 2016, or maybe it was early 17. But she said alternative facts, right? So the word alternative facts got a new meaning that day, and he has since changed his terminology. He's commented on having changed that terminology, no longer saying alternative facts. Okay, so he goes on in that video to also draw on some work from Chip and Dan Heath in a book called Made to Stick. And they use this acronym SUCCESS to talk about what makes an idea sticky, right? So when we're trying to replace incorrect information with correct information, we have to make it stick. And so the SUCCESS stands for first, simple. That means sometimes you have to take some of the nuance out of an explanation, which, of course, that means that sometimes the complexity of things gets overlooked, but the simplicity helps it to be sticky. Something that's unexpected, credible, concrete, and when they talk about things being concrete, they refer to things like analogies, metaphors, or stories that help people see how the correct information fits into the world. Emotional, so drawing on personal experience, connecting with people on a personal level is more effective. And John Cooks talks a lot about how you look to do that in science if you can, whereas science is often seen as being, purely rational or objective. If you can connect the science with some kind of personal experience, it's stickier. And then again, the idea of story as being a way to make things stick. Cook also pointed or kind of alluded to some elements of debunking a myth in that video I showed you. And in the debunking handbook, which I've linked to in this slide, he wrote that along with Stephen Lewandowski. They outline these elements. First are the core facts, and these are being presented in the order that one should introduce them. So first you're emphasizing the core fact of what is true, right? Rather than what's wrong. Then an explicit warning, so that before you mention the myth, you actually say, hey, heads up, this is not actually true. And then you give an alternative explanation. And that should be something that makes more sense to someone than does the myth. And then finally, graphics or visuals can be helpful for illustrating core facts. Another concept, I haven't heard John Cook talk specifically about this, but from my other work, I've come across the metaphor of the web of belief, which is initially presented by a philosopher by the last name of Quine. I think this is about around in 1952, and by Maureen Linker. I've got the references in the notes to that slide. Maureen Linker more recently wrote about this in a book called Intellectual Empathy. But basically, the web of belief is a way of describing our belief system. So our beliefs are part of a web, part of a larger system, and that web likes to be stable, right? It resists change because to have an unstable web is uncomfortable. It's our way of making sense of the world. So at the center of our web are our core beliefs. These are the things that we hold most dearly often. They're often tied closely to our sense of self and to our sense of belonging. And they are the most resistant to change, because if there is a change in the core of the web, there's going to be disruption of the entire web. And again, we're kind of desiring the status quo, desiring stability in our web. However, if a peripheral belief, a belief on the outer edges of the web is challenged, we're much more open to considering that because it doesn't disrupt the whole system. So when we're thinking about debunking misinformation, we might think about if there are ways we can frame the corrected information, if it's an issue where somebody might have strong feelings, which is often the case, You know, when we're looking at things like climate change or vaccines, people often have very strong beliefs, and those are tied to their sense of self. If that sense of core self is feeling threatened, the person is unlikely to consider the other information. So thinking about ways we might present information that kind of come at the periphery of the web can be more effective. Okay, so with that kind of basic understanding, I'm going to share a little bit more about how I designed this workshop. So similar to the algorithmic bias workshop that I talked about a couple of weeks ago, I use a Google Doc and I use Zoom as the web conference system, use both of those together. So the Google Doc facilitates engagement and interaction, and activities and reflection prompts are within that Google Doc. They're interspersed with new learning content. And then I structure the workshop basically as follows. I start with relating debunking to current issues, for example, the pandemic. And I ask participants to reflect on barriers to correcting misinformation. Then we explore the psychology of debunking and debunking strategies. And at the end, we have an activity where they evaluate the effectiveness of professional fact checks. And they brainstorm what's working well in this, and they also brainstorm possibilities for improvement. So you can see here this workshop template, there's a link to that. And it does have a Creative Commons license. So if anyone would like to reuse portions or all of it, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to open up that Google Doc also. And I'm just going to kind of walk through what I do. So this template, if you wanted to use it, you can make a copy of it, and then you can change it up whatever way makes sense to you. I begin with just welcoming people. And if it's a small group, and these workshops are open to everyone, so I usually get a mix of students, faculty, staff, sometimes community members. And it's usually a fairly small group. I hope that increases. But when it is a small group, I often ask people to just introduce themselves as they're comfortable and share about why they're interested in the topic. It's interesting to see the different people who come and the different perspectives that they have, the different roles that they have at the university or in the community. And I think people having some understanding of how each person is coming to the topic benefits everyone. So after those introductions, I also introduced the learning outcomes, which I shared a little bit earlier. And then I also present these guidelines for dialogue, and I explain these as how we will agree to treat one another during the workshop. And I find this useful as a way of just really affirming, valuing everyone's perspective, background, what they are bringing to our interaction, and recognizing that sometimes these topics can be sensitive. With that acknowledgement, I think that kind of affirms the valuing of everyone's contribution to the discussion and to the Google Doc as well. And I find the use of the Google Doc to be useful for getting people to reflect, taking time to pause before we jump into live discussion. And some groups are more active in engaging in live discussion. Others are more active with the Google Doc writing themselves. But by creating a little bit of space during activities for people to contribute to the Google Doc and then moving to the live discussion, I find that it increases the participation, it increases the possibility for people to see what others are saying and to build on what others are saying. And it builds that kind of sense of community that I hope to have in the workshops. Then the opening video that I've been showing is from the John Oliver show, or last week into tonight with John Oliver, I guess it's called now. And we just watched about a minute of this video, which is about coronavirus conspiracy theories. So relating it to something that is happening now, the pandemic, and this is from July 2020. So this is early on. We were seeing a lot of conspiracy theories that were coming out. And then I ask people to reflect on, so, this example up here, the John Oliver video, of course, is satiric. and it's showing more extreme cases of misinformation. But I also want to get to the point that sometimes misinformation is not so clear cut, right? Like sometimes it's much fuzzier. And I want to point to how confirmation bias, what we would like to believe, can also influence how we engage with information. So I ask people to consider some health claims that have been made in the news media, right? We often hear these different contradictory claims about, red wine is good for you, or in contrast to that, any level of alcohol consumption is bad for you. Drinking coffee is good for you, it's bad for you. And I ask people to think about, scrolling down here, if they gravitate toward or away from any of those claims, and if certain things influence their disinterest or interest in the claims. And that tends to open a good conversation about confirmation bias, how we have certain investments in believing certain things or not believing other things. And when we are invested in one way of thinking, then to have our view changed requires a higher level of evidence, right? Like, I love drinking coffee. So for me to decide that coffee is bad for my health, I would need a whole lot of evidence, much more evidence than I would need it's not on here, but if somebody said that lima beans were bad for your health, I would have no problem letting go of the lima beans. Okay, the next activity, we brainstorm reasons why it might be difficult to debunk misinformation. So rather than just launching into some of the psychology and science behind this, I ask people to think about possible reasons. And it's interesting to see that people pull out a lot of different dimensions of how debunking misinformation can be challenging. And then this is the video link that I just shared with you. We watch up to almost the first 7 minutes of that. So John Cook offers some strategies after talking about the basic mechanics behind debunking misinformation and why it's difficult. And so in the Google Doc, while people are watching this, they're also thinking about these two questions: what they would add to their initial list of reasons debunking misinformation is difficult, and what are some effective strategies. And then when the video is over, we take a little bit more time for people to add to the document, and then we discuss what people have added to it. Now, the content down here, these other tips, I usually paste this into the Google Doc during the workshop because I don't want it sitting in the document while people are brainstorming their responses to these previous questions. So these concepts, most of these are things that I have already talked about today, right? So the web of belief, and a phrase I didn't introduce yet is belief persistence, but that's the idea that we kind of want to keep our webs stable. We prefer the status quo generally when it comes to our belief systems. And so I end up, after some discussion, I paste this information into the document so that people have it to refer to, and I kind of walk through this. So then there's also the elements of debunking a myth that I shared, and I've got some references there as well. And then at the end, we do this activity where we evaluate the effectiveness of the couple of debunking videos from factcheck.org. And so there's a couple of examples here. The first one is talking about Trump's coronavirus claims somewhat early on in the pandemic. And we talk about what's effective about the debunking and what could be improved. And then the second one is on both Biden and Trump being wrong about coronavirus tests. I didn't want to have only examples that are, going in one partisan direction or another, because I know that people sometimes feel like, only the Republican Party gets targeted by left-leaning librarians who, are like biased against that, right? So trying to show that this is not a partisan issue, right? When we're looking at misinformation and correcting misinformation, that we see it across the political spectrum. So basically the same activity that we did above. And then time allowing, a lot of times there's not much time after this. This is a 1-hour workshop. But time allowing, I like to show this video on why humans are bad about thinking about climate change. This is a partnership between Vox and UCLA. And they talk about what motivates people or unmotivates them to take action to improve the environment. So looking at things like, carbon emissions. And, the kind of one of the takeaway messages is that when people see concrete small steps they can take that will make a difference, that is motivating, and that actually leads to behavioral change. Whereas when people see messages of kind of doom and gloom, there's no hope, they, kind of give up and throw up their hands. So we watch that video and talk about the implications this might have for countering misinformation, and if people see connections between it, and Cook's debunking tips. And that is about it. So I'm going to go back to my slides here. And so there is some, we have about 20 minutes left, so I want to start with questions and discussion, and then we'll see whether we have time to come back to those reflective questions that I introduced at the start. I'm going to stop sharing this. Okay.
Yeah, so if anyone has questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and we'll make sure Andrea gets it. I'm going to start with my question because, I'm the moderator and I could be greedy like that. Do you also try to work in teaching about debunking misinformation in other ways, like when you're doing those one-on-one sessions with the class or doing the BIs or the things like that? Or do you try and weave it into the other areas of your information literacy instruction?
Good question. I haven't really explicitly done that. I think I do try to weave certain concepts in. For example, when I'm talking with students about what search terms they are using to search for information, the fact that we often use search terms that are going to kind of confirm the argument that we're already trying to make, right? Or we look for sources that are going to fit with our thesis. And so I do talk about concepts like confirmation bias in that way, and ask people to think about like what might the other perspectives or other approaches to this topic be, and think about how you might choose search terms that also reflect that. Now, that's not to say that, all views are equal and we should therefore go look for sources that tell us the Holocaust didn't happen, right? Like, I'm not saying that, but like reasonable different perspectives on a given issue. So those kinds of concepts I try to bring in. If there is a moment where it would make sense to say, be aware that when you are introduced to an untrue headline, it's hard to like correct that in your mind, right? Like, I can see opportunity for perhaps discussing that in a kind of like side note in a class, but in my teaching context, I haven't had that happen a lot. Yeah.
And your workshop is 1 hour, right?
Yes, it's 1 hour.
All right. Have you used any of the lessons or videos from the News Literacy Project in their Checkology website?
Not explicitly. I have looked at that resource a number of times and through some of their materials, so it's probably influenced in conscious and unconscious ways things that I do, but I haven't looked at it in a little while, and I haven't taken like wholesale their materials. I'd be interested to hear though if other people are using certain resources or concepts there.
Have you ever recorded one of your workshops that you could share with librarians just to see one live in action?
I haven't done that, and the reason is that I really want those workshops to be interactive, and I want people to feel free to, think, reflect, and to not feel like they have to kind of watch what they're saying so much, like, worrying that like other people are going to see it later. So they are fairly interactive, as you can see from the Google Doc. There are activities throughout. And I don't share the Google Doc with people who aren't registered for the workshop. So because of that, I have not done that. And I do also tell them at the beginning that they can choose to contribute to the Google Doc anonymously if they prefer, in which case they need to be logged out of a Google account. So if they are logged into their Google account when they're in that Google Doc, their name will appear. So I clarify that up front. So I really want people to, feel like their privacy is respected and that they have some choices there. Although I recognize the advantages of doing a recording as well.
Do you think as librarians and academics that we overvalue truth or evidence as a reason people choose to believe something? Many people choose their beliefs for other reasons other than something is true or false.
Yeah, I think probably most of us, myself included, probably default to that idea of, well, of course, people value evidence. And even for myself, I probably think of myself as valuing evidence and reason as the driving forces of like how I make decisions. But the reality is that, I'm sure I'm often making decisions that are not based primarily on reasoning, right? I forget who the researcher was who found that even when very intelligent people believe that they are making their decisions based on facts and reasons, they're often really not, right? So I think having some humility about that and recognizing that we all do this, we make decisions that might be informed partly by evidence, but also maybe less than we recognize by other things like, our own motivations. I think it's helpful to be aware of that and then still bring that understanding to looking at evidence and working towards, critical thinking that takes that into account, as well as taking into account an awareness of like, what are my own biases? What are my own beliefs? How might those be shaping the way I'm thinking, the way I'm acting?
I'm going to go a little out of order from the questions that we're getting because I think this kind of fits into it. To what extent do you deal with biases like confirmation bias in our human emotional reactions?
In this workshop?
Kate, in the workshop or just in general? Yes, in the workshop.
Yeah, so I mentioned talking about things like the web of beliefs and how our belief systems influence what we believe, how we look at evidence, how our own motivations influence how we examine evidence. So I think those activities reflect most of the ways that I engage with the concept of confirmation bias. And I know that I have presented a lot of information in a short period of time. So if people are interested in going back to that Google Doc, that might be a good place to just see. There are some places where I explicitly mention confirmation bias, and then there are other places where it's kind of implicitly playing a role. Like, when I introduce the concept of web of belief, I also end up discussing confirmation bias, even though it is not the foremost concept that I start out with, right? It is where we end up as we're talking about the web of belief. Confirmation bias is certainly playing a big role there.
Okay. Can you speak about what inspired you to teach about this topic?
Yeah, reflecting back on how I got to this. So, because it's, been kind of like an intersection of different interests. So before I was at my current position at Rowan University, I taught at University of West Georgia. I was teaching a credit-bearing information literacy course. And I started teaching that in fall 2016 when, we kind of like everybody was like, wow, we have way more political polarization than we realized, right? And so I ended up shifting the focus of that class to looking at information behaviors and cognitive biases. And that is what kind of started me on looking at a lot of these issues, right? At least in a more intentional way. So that's also when I encountered John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski's work on debunking. And so I integrated some of those materials into that class. And then when I came to Rowan, I'm a subject librarian. I don't teach a credit-bearing course, But in this workshop series that we offer, I do a lot of, things that are about digital literacy, and thinking especially about issues that really affect us today. So spread of misinformation, evaluating information, particular online sources, and then debunking is one piece of that. So it's, it's kind of become a way for me to you do more than the traditional one-shot session and reach different kinds of audiences that might be interested in these issues. There was maybe a kind of indirect answer, but so let me know if I need to clarify any of that.
All right. Do you use or have you used or have any thoughts on the first draft content around information disorder? And there was a link in the chat because I'm not familiar with it myself.
I need to look at that again. That sounds familiar what the person said. Can you say that title of that document title one more time?
First draft content around information disorder.
I know I've looked at that, but I haven't looked at it like in the last few weeks. So I need to look again, like to comment in a more intelligent way. I think I need to look again at the specifics of what's in there. But if someone has a question about like particular things that are in there, particular concepts, I might be able to speak more to that immediately. I mean, I would say that I think First Draft has some great resources, and I've used a lot of them and found them to be valuable, particularly ones around things like confirmation bias and misinformation.
So in your workshop, do you talk about what to do when you find something that challenges or even changes your belief?
Sorry, well, can you say that one more time?
Sure. In your workshop, do you talk about what to do when you find something that challenges or changes your beliefs?
I think this workshop is a little more focused on trying to share corrected information with other people. That's kind of where it's more focused, but it does touch on thinking about our own beliefs too. For example, in that early activity, where I asked people to think about, these different claims that are made about health claims that are made about coffee, alcohol, chocolate, right? Are you kind of inclined toward a certain view of those contradicting claims? That is a place where I ask people to think a little bit more about that. And then introducing the web of belief is also a place where I'm asking people to reflect on what are your own core beliefs, peripheral beliefs? How does your sense of self, sense of the things you value influence how you respond to information? But I think there's not as much explicit focus on personal reflection as there is on kind of like messaging to other people. Though this question does make me wonder about like, are there ways I could build that in a little bit more of the reflexive element than is currently in there? I think I was going to say in response to that. Well, it is also making me think of the idea of simply pausing and the power of pausing. So this may be something that I can integrate more explicitly into this workshop. Some people may be familiar with Mike Caulfield's work on SIFT, right, and lateral reading. And so lateral reading being moving off of a website and looking at what others say about it. And SIFT is kind of a process for that lateral reading. And the first part of SIFT is to stop and pause. And that includes noticing if you're having a strong emotional reaction to something. And if you are, that can be a kind of cue to you that you may need to slow down and kind of recognize that you may be being influenced by your own personal beliefs, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's a very human thing, right? But that you may be leaning more towards certain views or certain information because of those beliefs. So I think that is something that I could integrate, like that emphasis on pausing and reflection and the power of that as a way of trying to move past an initial knee-jerk reaction to information before really taking into account the information that's in front of you, the evidence that's in front of you.
Okay, so related to that, possibly as a way to reduce the shame that might be inherent in debunking, do you think it's important to normalize that everyone likely has accepted some level of misinformation?
Yeah, definitely. Yes, that this is a human thing. And I try to do that, I think, with these different kinds of activities, like the early activity where we reflect on these different health claims. And I acknowledge that I myself, I like to believe some of those health claims and I don't want to believe others, right? And giving an example like that is a little, it's unlikely to elicit like really vulnerable or strong emotions from people, right? Because most people don't feel like their core beliefs are being tapped into when we talk about whether or not you want to believe chocolate's good for you. So starting with an example like that feels a little more innocuous to people, I think, also gives a kind of easier entry point than if we started with something that, was more polarizing.
Okay, so how do you deal with media and the misinformation that comes from media, especially when it starts leaning towards propaganda?
I'm trying to think of that in the context of this specific workshop, and then versus like how I would teach about it outside of this. It may be something I need to think a little bit more about. I have not done a workshop explicitly on propaganda. I've done a workshop and a lot of other teaching around evaluating online sources, partly through lateral reading and partly through critical source analysis. So I think a lot of those principles can be applied to propaganda. And then I guess when you're looking at propaganda, there's also the emotional elements of it. And the fact that it does often tap into often core beliefs. But again, I haven't done much instruction around propaganda specifically. It would be an interesting area, though, that I've read some on that I think I could learn more about. I'd be interested to hear how other people are approaching that.
So you talk about confirmation bias. Do you talk to the students or your participants about negative bias?
About negative bias. Maybe the person who asked that question could tell me a little more about what they, how they would explain negative bias. I'm not familiar with that particular phrase, so that might influence how I respond to that question.
Negative bias is our human tendency to remember negative more than positive.
Oh, okay.
Research shows it takes about 5 to 7 positive things to outweigh a negative.
Okay, so like the negativity bias, I've usually heard that talked about as the negativity bias. Okay. And so the question was like, how do I address the?
Is it brought up in class or just the confirmation bias? Are they kind of brought in together?
I haven't brought the concept of the negativity bias into this workshop, but I'm actually going to write that down because I think you all are giving me some good ideas for ways that I might tweak this. I think that would be it would be helpful to integrate that as well. Like, it's interesting because on the other hand, like the flip side of that, there's other biases that kind of counteract the negativity bias, right? So, for example, the worldview backfire effect is one thing that I talk about in that workshop, and that's that we want to believe things that already fit into our worldviews. And when we want to believe, those kinds of things that kind of reinforce or challenge our worldviews are often things that tap into core beliefs, right? So if I believe that the world is flat, the earth is flat, I probably believe that pretty strongly, like, if I believe the world is flat or the earth is flat versus the world is round, like there's often a lot of other beliefs that are like wrapped up in those beliefs right? And so if that view gets challenged, I'm probably going to be pretty resistant to changing it. So it's like we do also want to believe the things that we want to believe, and we want to like believe things that make us comfortable. So I'm going to think more about how I might bring that idea of negativity bias in, and at the same time acknowledge these other biases that don't quite fit into that bias, right? Like there's so many different biases that sometimes like they're kind of competing with each other in a way.
All right, I think we have one last question. Do you have, sorry, do you have ideas or experiences that help communicating uncertainty? In the nuanced world, the most correct information might be less certain in their declarations than misinformation. Debunk connotes replacing ideas, but what if one idea, the corrected idea, introduces, I got tongue-tied, more uncertainty?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't have, in the spirit of uncertainty, I don't yet have a clear-cut answer for it, but I will say that one thing that I stressed in that workshop is that it's maybe a little uncomfortable that in debunking misinformation, one of the strategies for making things sticky is to make it simple, which means that sometimes some of the nuance gets lost, right? And so if you're just trying to correct the misinformation, you don't want to give someone a really complicated, in-depth explanation of why it's not true. Now, if it's something where someone's really learning about a topic in depth, then hopefully you can follow that debunking up with a deeper dive into the topic, you know, and someone's really curious about it, and then they can learn more about the complexity behind it. So I think it is useful to, when you're debunking things, not worry too much about getting into a lot of the nuance, you know, because some of these things that you're debunking are pretty like clear cut, right? Like climate change real. And so maybe it's a kind of a matter of thinking about when you address uncertainty and to what degree you address it and how you address it, right? Which I think depends a lot on the context, right? So there may be times where it's just not going to be productive to emphasize a lot of uncertainty. Like there are moments in this pandemic where I'm like, let me just like not dwell in uncertainty, right? Even though uncertainty is still there. And then there are other days where it's like, no, like let's accept it, let's look at it. So yeah, in my ambiguous answer, it's a thing I'd like to think more about, but where I think a lot of it's going to depend a lot on your context.
Okay, well, we are officially at 1 hour. So thank you, everyone. We still have 100 people through the Q&A, so that shows how fascinating the topic is and you. So thank you, Andrea, for meeting with us twice. Within about 24 hours, I should have the links sent out, the video sent out. So everyone who's been here, I'll get that to you. And if any questions, feel free to email me directly and I'll make sure Andrea gets them. So thank you again.
Thanks, April. And I'm going to put my email in the chat too. So if people want to email me, you're welcome to email me directly too. Thank you all so much for being here today, for the great questions. Good things for me to think about.
Thank you.